This is my quantitative data collection. So quantitative research is carried out by positivist researchers, and it measures what people think in a logical way instead of their feelings. So you're going to get factual answers, which can provide statistics and numerical forms of data. So that makes it quite easy to analyse large samples of data. Primary data is data that the researcher collects directly from first-hand experience, so it's going to be observation, interview, questionnaire, and advantages of this, so it can be tailored directly to the research, so it will be quantitative. That means it will be reliable and you're going to get up-to-date results. So disadvantage, though, there is a risk of bias, so people might give socially acceptable answers due to the wording of the question because they want social desirability. So there's going to be no proof of validity because the participant could just lie. And there are certain forms of primary data, such as interviews, take a lot of time to administer, especially a lot of them, and it can also be really expensive to do. So for instance, quantitative interview with a gymnast asking about training. So that would be, how many hours do you train a day? And they might say 4. Secondary data is information that's been created for a purpose, but that isn't your current research project, but obviously it will still be relevant to it. So this can take the form of statistics, web information, books, and it's really easy to access. There's abundance of different information from loads of different sources. So this means it's going to be really cheap to gather, because all you might need is a Google search. So the information you gain from it can be used to support your study, as well as getting more insight and knowledge around the subject. But disadvantage, if you're getting it online, it might not actually be a credible source because anyone can post anything. So this means that you need to check the reference because they are all going to have varying qualities. And also, it might provide insufficient detail. So, for example, if you're reading a Great British Gymnast blog about their training and using that information for your research, it could consist of, I trained 4 hours today, like I do every day. Levels of measurement, so there are lots of different types. There's nominal, which is a form of categorical data which has no hierarchy. So the categories are mutually exclusive and it can have numerical values. So for instance, 1 could mean female gymnasts and 2 could mean male gymnasts. These values have no significance. So the advantage of nominal is it can provide very clear information, but it's going to provide very limited information. So for instance, gymnasts with different hair colours are put into different categories. This will not provide information about which gymnast is better, but you would also not be able to provide to make assumptions either. You can't say brown-haired gymnasts are more skillful than blonde ones. So you can statistically analyse this via the mode, because there's frequency of data. So this can be presented in a pie chart. So you could write 70% of gymnasts in a club have brown hair. You can have dichotomous data with nominal, which means that there are going to be 2 discrete, which is separate categories. So you might have male and female gymnasts, yes or no, and then left and right-handed, so they're going to be put in 2 clear different categories, sections. So you've got discrete and continuous data. Discrete means that the variables are measured across fixed values, which could be age, for instance, and they usually used on arbitrary scales. Continuous, on the other hand, is measured on a continuous scale, which can be divided into fractions. For instance, temperature. They also have a very fine subdivision, which means you can measure accurately and compare 2 items and determine the difference. So ordinal is discrete. This is data with values that can be ranked, so it's usually on a Likert scale. The data is scaled to present people's attitudes towards the subject, so you can count the order but you can't actually measure the difference. So, for instance, a rating scale of 1 to 5 representing strongly dislike, neutral, like, strongly like. So, obviously, a rating of 5 indicates more enjoyment than a rating of 4. But if gymnasts were asked to rate their favourite apparatus in this scale, there is no clear measurement between the points. Because it's not always going to be the same. So the gymnast may love the floor and rate it 5, but only quite like the beam and rate it 4, but also have quite a big like of the bars and also rate that 4. So this is going to reduce validity levels all throughout. And for the plus side, it is quite an easy test data to administer and repeat, so you're going to have high reliability. And you can use statistical analysis methods such as median, mode, or percentage. You've got interval, which is a type of continuous data. This measures the distance between any two neighbouring units of measurement that are going to be the same, but the 0 point has no meaning. So it's a numerical scale with a meaningful order. The interval points can be added, subtracted, but not meaningfully multiplied or divided. So, for instance, the changes in a gymnast's temperature after completing plyometric training. So, statistic analysis for this would be via the mean, median, and mode, but you can't multiply, divide, or ration. And positive, it's continuous, which means you can compare intervals and determine the difference. Ratio is another type of continuous data, so numbers can be compared as multiples of each other, and there is a meaningful natural zero in this type of data, which means you can express the difference between the values twice as much. So you can do ratio data on gymnasts' height, their weight, their age, do fitness tests. Advantages, maybe you can manipulate the data easily. You've got the opportunity to do descriptive statistics, so you can get mean and standard deviation, etc., and inferential statistics, so when you can do stat tests and correlational stat tests, etc. And I guess disadvantage might be you can't go below 0. So there are lots of types of quantitative data collection. Laboratory experiment, so this type of experiment conducted in a well-controlled environment, so accurate measurements are really possible. So it's a lot easier to replicate because it's a standardized procedure, and the cause and effect relationship are established because variables are really precisely controlled. However, it's an unnatural setting, so that's going to produce unnatural behaviour, and therefore it's not really possible to find these generalise these findings to a real life setting. So an example of this is gymnast flexibility in different temperatures. So temperature is an independent variable, and all the other variables would be controlled, such as the procedure, for instance the sit and reach test. So field experiments are done in real life environment of the participants, so the experimenter still manipulates the independent variable, but they can't control the extraneous variables, unlike lab. So this is going to have high ecological validity because it's going to reflect a real life situation, and the researchers are going to have less control over extraneous variables, so that's an issue, and that could bias the results. It also makes it really difficult for another researcher to replicate the study in exactly the same way. So you could use the same example, that temperature can be manipulated each week, and they can be told to do this sit and reach test each week and see the performance, if it gets more flexible or not, but they're not going to know. True experiment. So This has both control and experimental groups where participants are randomly assigned. So they're all tested pre and post intervention. So this allows us to see if the intervention was the reason for the progress in the control group. If both groups can progress, then the intervention is not going to be the reason. So, for example, if gymnasts complete the multi-stage fitness test to see the effect of caffeine on performance, and they use the first 12 people that walk in the room, the first 6 are going to be in the control group and the other 6 aren't, then if they went for longer, you can see to see who went for longer. So you're going to be able to compare the two groups and the effect of caffeine. A pre-experiment has pre and post treatment tests, but there's no control group. So there's using the same example, you can't compare the control groups, so because there's not one, compared to a control group because there's not one, and you therefore are going to be unsure of the impact of caffeine. And a quasi-experiment, so that's has pre and post tests, and there's a control group, but there's no random assignment of duties, well, of subjects. So using the same example, the researchers can choose who has the caffeine. Right, so in general there are lots of advantages and disadvantages to experimental methods. For instance, you can easily establish the cause and effect relationship if all the variables are controlled, because this can also be really hard with human participants. Generates quantitative data that can be analysed by inferential statistical tests, so the researcher can say the likelihood of the results from chance rather than manipulating the dependent variable, and if it's a representative sample it can be generalised, just things like that. So observation, this is a notational analysis, so that's the study of movement patterns and strategy and tactics. Advantage of this is you can video it. You can video the gymnast's performance and annotate it later, so you can identify their strengths and weaknesses, and you can really, if it's like a group piece, then you can value all the contributions to the performance, and you can show improvement in previous videos, and you compare it to other gymnasts or themselves. However, disadvantage might be that you miss some behaviours. You don't always know the context of the performance, so why someone performed the way they did. But they could have been ill, which means they performed worse today than last week. So an example of this would be a notational analysis to study movement of elite and non-elite gymnasts whilst completing a floor routine to compare the differences. Quantitative questionnaire. So a quantitative questionnaire contains closed questions and Likert scales so that the data collected is numerical, statistical and really easy to analyse. The researcher controls the possibility of all the outcomes, so they provide the researcher with factual answers and it's really easy to quantify and interpret. However, this can actually lead to forced responses which lack realism, because the specific responses might not be entirely true, so this does reduce the validity levels. So a question in a quantitative questionnaire might include, do you enjoy training? And the response would be yes or no. So again, it can be issues with content, you might not get the most information that you want.